Okay, now, what we did is last week, we focused on just those 2 lecture periods on the actual assassination of President Kennedy, because that event plays such a central role in bringing to a head the focus on what it is that this behind-the-scenes cabal that President Roosevelt was talking about in 1936, and which was talked about by Woodrow Wilson even earlier in 1919. And again, I'll focus your attention on it. It's on the third page or 4th page of your syllabus. But remember that this is what Woodrow Wilson said in his book, The New Freedom, in 1913. He said, "An invisible empire has been set up in our nation above the forms of democracy, a power so organized, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, and so pervasive that some of the biggest men in the United States in the fields of commerce, manufacture, and government know that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of this group." That's what Woodrow Wilson said in 1913. And in 1936, Roosevelt said, "We must struggle against these enemies of peace, these owners of business and financial monopolies, the financial speculators, and the men in charge of reckless banking practices and war profiteering. These forces have come to consider our American government to be a mere appendage of their private business affairs. We must beware that our government is being run by the interests of organized wealth, and it is just as dangerous as if our government were being run by an organized mob. Never before in all of our history have these forces been so united as they are today. This concentration of corporate power and private wealth is seriously impairing the effectiveness of our American economic system to provide adequate employment opportunities to our people or adequate capital to smaller businesses. In short, this concentration of power is impairing our economy from being able to assure an equitable distribution of income and earnings among the people of our nation." Now, he points out, in addition to that, at the 1936 Democratic National Convention, and that is now, what, 70, what is it, how many years from before this? Is this 80 years or something ago? He says, "It is to be entirely expected that these privileged princes of our new corporate economic dynasty, thirsting for power and private profit as they do, would reach out to seek control over the government itself. They have indeed done this and have created a new despotism, which they have wrapped in the robes of legal sanction. Into their service, these modern mercenaries have sought to draft our people, our labor, and our property. We now face a financial and industrial dictatorship in which the political equality that we once believed we had finally won has now become meaningless in the face of this new degree of economic inequality. A very small group of extremely wealthy and politically powerful men has now successfully concentrated into their own hands almost complete control over other people's property, other people's money, other people's labor, and other people's lives. For too many of us, therefore, our lives are no longer truly free." Okay, so that this is the kind of language that was used by 2 of the kind of almost immediately prior presidential office holders of the Democratic Party in explaining this group to the American people. And the last week we discussed how far it is that those people had really gone as of 1963 in actually physically assassinating the President of the United States, whom they believed, with some good reason, was engaged in a series of private negotiations with Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Socialist Republic, to dismantle the nuclear warheads of the American arsenal, along with those of the Soviet arsenal. And this was an arsenal which the people in this cabal that is referenced by Wilson and Roosevelt had spent virtually 100 years putting together so that they could establish their hegemony over the economic resources of the planet through the offices of the American military and then CIA. And so that what I want to talk about in these next two lectures for this week, the 9th week of our only 10-week course, I want to talk about the aftermath of the presidential assassination. Because this actually becomes one of the most extraordinary periods of time in an approximate 10-year or so period that is so pivotal to the present history of our United States. Because immediately after the assassination of President Kennedy, we've touched upon, but only briefly, the fact that Lyndon Johnson, immediately upon returning to Washington, D.C., revoked a national security decision directive that was issued by President Kennedy, ordering the United States military to start withdrawing the some 18,000 men that were deployed in Vietnam. That he wanted to have 1,000 of these men withdrawn right away, and was directing the military to set up plans to withdraw them all by the end of 1965. That would have been the year after he was reelected, if he had lived. And they also, Lyndon Johnson also, of course, immediately stopped the negotiations that were going on with Nikita Khrushchev to try to take the limited strategic arms limitations treaty that had been established in September of 1963 to bring it to its full completion that had been already directed by Kennedy to the State Department in another National Security Action Memorandum, directing the State Department to carry out a 3-step negotiation with the Soviet Union that would lead to the total nuclear disarmament of the United States and Russia. So these two major steps that were taken by Lyndon Johnson in the immediate aftermath of the assassination of the president are critical. And of course, the additional step of Lyndon Johnson appointing the Warren Commission to take out of the hands of the Justice Department, out of the hands of any congressional investigating committee, out of the hands of any other law enforcement officials, the actual ultimate investigation of the assassination of President Kennedy. And we've noted that, in fact, this commission was established with the direct instructions behind the scenes that they were to affirm the conclusion that had been reached by J. Edgar Hoover in the FBI within 1 week of the assassination, that the assassination had been carried out solely and exclusively by Lee Harvey Oswald without the involvement of any other person. And that we saw that the Warren Commission was dedicated to getting that accomplished. And I've directed your attention to, if you choose to do so, to review many of the documents of the Warren Commission. And you can see from the interrogations that are being directed by the FBI of all of witnesses that they are clearly, intentionally attempting to suppress any evidence that runs contrary to the charge, or prompt, if you will, that they have been given by Lyndon Johnson when they established them, and which Lyndon Johnson had gone to the peculiar length of appointing Allen Dulles to actually see to it that this was enforced. Yes.
Did Robert F. Kennedy recommend that, though?
No, that's what he said.
That's what he said.
But that isn't true. That isn't true, because Robert Kennedy actually was confidentially, Robert Kennedy was communicating to Nikita Khrushchev that he believed that there was a very powerful small cabal in the United States who were behind the assassination of President Kennedy. He actually communicated that to him through a close friend of his, which was a Bill, was it the same name as the fellow who was a major basketball player for Washington? Pardon, no, not Bill Bradley, but another fellow. Anyway, he was sending private communications to Nikita Khrushchev, telling Khrushchev that Bobby Kennedy believed that this assassination was carried out by this small cabal of very rich and powerful people in the United States. But Lyndon Johnson not only appointed Allen Dulles to be the de facto head of this commission, but to give it the pastiche of independence that might have been questioned by having the recently fired head of the CIA head up the investigation. He went to Earl Warren and secretly told Earl Warren that you need to head up this commission because I need to take steps to conceal the fact that there was a private assassination team that was fielded to attempt to assassinate Fidel Castro. And he lied to Warren and told him that this assassination group had been created by and fielded by John Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy, which is a complete and total abject lie, that it was created by Richard Nixon. And Lyndon Johnson lied to Warren and actually gave him the charge of specifically concealing the existence of the very team that assassinated the president. So we know of those events that took place. But what I want to start talking about this week for the next two lectures that we have here of our 17th and or 16th and 17th lectures in the final lectures, or the 17th and 18th actually, that I want to point out the fact that there was this rising crescendo of dissatisfaction on the part of not only the vast majority of the baby boomer generation, the biggest generation in the history of the United States, in fact, the biggest generation in the history of the world, that our generation became growingly disaffected, not only with the false report of the Warren Commission that came out with this ridiculous thesis of this single unscathed bullet that had killed both President Kennedy and wounded John Connally, and mysteriously, miraculously, one might say, shown up on the stretcher, allegedly the stretcher of Governor Connally, which it turns out it wasn't even on that stretcher. But that they asserted that this was the bullet that had killed the president, that had shot the president through the back and through the neck and John Connally. But in fact, the entire series of preposterous conclusions that the Warren Commission came to generated a growing disaffection on the part of the baby boomer generation, not only with the results of the Warren Commission, but with the consequences of the ongoing Vietnam War that had been reinstigated by Lyndon Johnson, right in the face of President Kennedy's direct order to start winding that war down and pulling our troops out. So that there was this period of growing dissatisfaction and disaffection on the part of the largest generation among the American population, and additional people outside of the baby boomer generation growingly came to be disaffected with both the conclusions of the Warren Commission and with the growing Vietnam War. And that there also resulted, because Lyndon Johnson, in the face of this growing dissatisfaction, felt compelled to try to compensate for what it is he had done in reopening the Vietnam War and suppressing any kind of legitimate investigation of the assassination of President Kennedy, what he did is he offered this soporific of actually backing the passage of the 1964 Federal Civil Rights Act, which he attributed to Kennedy, that Kennedy wanted to go forward with actually providing federal protection to members of the black race, to protect them against being barred from voting and registering and having equal access to facilities throughout the South, in many parts of the North for that matter. So he kept pushing forward the passage of this Federal Civil Rights Act of 1964 to give people the impression that he was really sympathetic with the policies of President Kennedy, and therefore to direct suspicion away from himself and others whom people might have started to suspect of having been involved in assassinating President Kennedy if every single policy that Kennedy had advocated had done a 180-degree turn. And what that generated was an extraordinary split in the Democratic Party of Lyndon Johnson. And there was this rather extraordinary event that took place in the 1964 presidential convention, in which the entire South walked out, all except for the state of Georgia, but Mississippi, Alabama, and North Carolina and others walked out of the convention because Lyndon Johnson agreed to seat one black delegate to the National Democratic Convention. And so they all got up and walked out. And this caused a split in the party, and it caused Richard Nixon, who was going to be running again in 1968, it caused Richard Nixon to begin what they call the Southern strategy of trying to recruit the now disaffected racist members of the Democratic Party in the southern states to re-register as Republicans, to assist Nixon in regaining or gaining the White House in 1968. So this entire period between 1964 and 1968 was characterized by this rising crescendo of disaffection on the part of our generation and the rest of the American public with the Warren Commission report and with the war in Vietnam. And it was not, in fact, effectively compensated for by the passage of the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1964, because the forces in the South rose up to fight back against this Federal Civil Rights Act, therefore causing even greater disruption in the South. And that you had college students and stuff going into the South along with Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and SNCC and other groups. And so there was a great deal of turmoil occurring in the United States between 1964 and 1965. And it wasn't all just because of the war in Vietnam. It was also because of the federal civil rights movement, the rising of the National Organization for Women, the assertion of the rights of women and equal rights in the workplace for women. And what happened is this led us all the way to the year of 1968. And it is entirely accurate for you to remember that the year 1968 was a major political watershed in American political history, because this is the year that when Lyndon Johnson was running to be reelected to his second full term. He had served out the final year of President Kennedy's first term, had been reelected in 1964 against Barry Goldwater in what was almost a 60% to 40% wipeout in the presidential election, and then what had happened is Lyndon Johnson prosecuted the war in Vietnam from 1964, after having been reelected, all the way to 1968, generating what was a near revolution in the United States. It's absolutely essential that you realize, or it's essential for me to be able to effectively communicate to you, the seriousness of the situation that obtained at that time. I was at Harvard Law School, and as I may have noted, was the co-founder of the Harvard Civil Rights Law Review in 1968, right in that halcyon year. And I was deeply involved with two of my Harvard Law School professors, Abe Shea, who was the principal foreign policy advisor for Bobby Kennedy, and Adam Yarmolinsky, who was his major defense advisor. And we were trying, not just the three of us, but a lot of other people that were working with us, were trying to persuade Bobby Kennedy to run for the Democratic Party presidential nomination against Lyndon Johnson, the sitting president, who had announced that he wanted to have a second full term. So Bobby Kennedy was refusing to do this, saying that he thought that if he challenged Lyndon Johnson for the presidency during the primary, that it was going to, because of the revolt on the part of the Southern Democrats already, that it was going to splinter the Democratic Party. It was very similar to the kind of conversation that you were hearing going on a couple weeks ago about the Republican Party this year, before Donald Trump started saying things like, well, his suggestion about building the wall between here and Mexico was just an idea. And he was just sort of suggesting that maybe they would not allow any Muslims into the country, and that he's now meeting with the leadership of the more regular Democrat or Republican Party, and they're actually coming to some kind of a love fest in trying to suggest that really the disruption is going on in the Democratic Party, simply because Bernie is continuing to run. In any event, in 1968, Bobby Kennedy was pushing back against those of us who were actively engaged in trying to persuade him to run. And I was privileged to be in sort of a special place at the time there at Harvard Law School, where his potential Secretary of State, Professor Abe Shea, and his potential Secretary of Defense, Adam Yarmolinsky, were both advocating that he run against Lyndon Johnson. And I was there with them, working with them, helping try to get that to happen. And we sent emissaries to Bobby Kennedy, Joe Graham Maison, and Gary Hart to try to talk Bobby into running. But he said, no, this would be very bad for the Democratic Party, and he didn't want to do it. And so once we were finally convinced that he wasn't going to do it, Joe Graham Maison and Gary Hart went to see Eugene McCarthy, who was the Democratic senator from Minnesota, and they talked him into running against Lyndon Johnson on the anti-Vietnam War position, to oppose the war. And what happened is in January of 1968, right at the beginning of this halcyon year of 1968, Eugene McCarthy almost beat Lyndon Johnson in the New Hampshire presidential primary for the Democratic Party. And Lyndon Johnson immediately withdrew from the Democratic presidential primary, saying that he wanted to spend all of his time trying to figure out how to end the war in Vietnam in an honorable way, which means with the United States winning, which wasn't exactly a reasonable policy. But he was trying to blunt the offensive that had been mounted against him by the anti-war community in the United States, led largely by the baby boom generation, that were now this largest of all generations rising into political power, because we were now becoming 18, 19, 20 years old, and we're all registering to vote. And it became clear that the Democratic Party was getting ready to be kind of inundated with baby boomers who were all opposed to the war. And so Lyndon Johnson tried to offer this kind of peace proposal to them, and he withdrew from the Democratic primary. And immediately, Bobby Kennedy entered the Democratic presidential primary race. And from that point on, it basically sucked all of the oxygen out of Eugene McCarthy's presidential campaign run, which he was a bit resentful about. But on the other hand, that wasn't our primary concern. Our primary concern was definitely being able to win the Democratic nomination, because if in fact Richard Nixon were to obtain the Republican Party nomination in 1968, which we believed he would, we thought it was going to be necessary to have Bobby Kennedy run in order to beat him. And Bobby Kennedy began his campaign in January of 1968 on the anti-war plank in the platform. And in fact, there wasn't any doubt whatsoever that Bobby Kennedy was in the process of winning the Democratic primary. And Richard Nixon was winning the Republican primary. And very importantly, from the point of view of information that we've been discussing already in this class, it turns out that George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, springboarding off from the resentment on the part of the Southern Democrats to the 1964 Federal Civil Rights Act, George Wallace of Alabama announced his candidacy for the presidency of the United States on an independent third-party ticket, the American Independent Party. And his vice presidential candidate, you're going to love this, was General Curtis LeMay. The same General Curtis LeMay who was the Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force, who had confronted Kennedy, who had sat cheek by jowl with General Lemonster in the proposal of Operation Northwoods, that they dress up Cuban anti-Castro refugees in Cuban uniforms and have them attack Guantanamo military base and blow up shopping centers in Miami and blow up American monuments in Washington, D.C. This is the guy, Curtis LeMay, ran as vice president with George Wallace on an American Independent Party, and in fact won 13% of the vote in the 1968 presidential campaign. And what a lot of people don't realize is that Richard Nixon ended up as the nominee for the Republican Party, campaigning on a proposed plank to figure out a way to get us out of the war in Vietnam. Everybody seemed to be suddenly coming on board with kind of saying they really wanted to end the war in Vietnam. But the only person that anyone believed on that, in that regard, was Robert Kennedy. And so Robert Kennedy, in fact, he went all the way to the point of winning the California Democratic primary race, which you now know, I assume every single one of you knows, is going to be held on June 6th, or June 7th, here, okay? And it was on June 6th of 1968, and Bobby Kennedy won the Republican, or won the Democratic primary race in California on June 6th of 1968, and was assassinated on the evening of June 6th, right after winning the California primary. And so that suddenly, when it was perfectly clear, that it had been clear from the evening of the 6th of June until later on that night when he was assassinated, that the Democratic Party had chosen him to be the Democratic presidential nominee. But suddenly, as of dawn on June 7th, he had been cut down, and the Democratic Party was without a Democratic nominee. And so they turned to they turned to Hubert Humphrey, who had been the vice president under Lyndon Johnson. After Lyndon Johnson took over as the president after the killing of President Kennedy on November 22nd of 1963. And his vice president had, in fact, been Hubert Humphrey, a very widely respected liberal in the Democratic Party. And so Hubert Humphrey ascends to the position of the nominee of the Democratic Party in 1968, the favored nominee at the Democratic Convention in Chicago. And now you have that other major event of 1968, because you'd already had the withdrawal of Lyndon Johnson from the presidential primary. You had the entering into the Democratic primary of Bobby Kennedy. You had him rising like a rocket to the top of the Democratic Party. People suspecting, and it turns out to be true, that he was planning to reopen the investigation of the assassination of President Kennedy if he were elected. Then you have the assassination of Martin Luther King that takes place in April of 1968. Then you have the assassination of Bobby Kennedy on the evening of June 6th of 1968. And you have George Wallace and Curtis LeMay open up a third-party offensive with the scurrilous enemies of John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. And so that you then have the Democratic Convention in Chicago, where tens of thousands of baby boomers from around the country descended upon Chicago and demanded that Hubert Humphrey, as a condition of his being the nominee for the Democratic presidential nomination, that he renounce the Vietnam War policies of Lyndon Johnson and agree to withdraw the troops from Vietnam. And the Boss Daley of the Democratic Party in Chicago ordered into the streets tens of thousands of Chicago police, fully armed with tear gas and nightsticks and riot gear, and basically attacked the demonstrators. And I say that without any reservation, because there was a full-scale investigation of it, and an official government investigation determined that this was a police riot, that the police rioted and attacked the demonstrators and savagely beat them, and had to pay major amounts of money damages to the victims of those assaults later on. But what happened is, with all of this turmoil in the country in 1968, it goes to the presidential election in November of 1968, and Hubert Humphrey ended up winning 43.4%, no, excuse me, went 42.7% of the popular vote, and Richard Nixon won 43.4%. So it was basically 43% to 43.4% for Richard Nixon, along with George Wallace and Curtis LeMay getting 13.5%. So it was a razor thin race that took place in the fall of 1968. But the tragic result was that Richard Nixon won the presidency in the fall of 1968. So what you have here is you had an entire interstices between the election of 1960, in which Richard Nixon ran for the presidency against John F. Kennedy and lost, and then him finally coming into the presidency 8 years later in 1968, after the intercession of Lyndon Johnson for a full term, and then the the interruption of his quest for the presidency by Lyndon Johnson wiping out Barry Goldwater in 1964. So Nixon did not make the mistake of sacrificing himself in the 1964 election. He reserved his energy and political capital, ran in 1968, and basically just beat Hubert Humphrey by less than 1% of the votes cast. And so, but the problem was that thereupon Richard Nixon reascended to a position of power that he had been in 1960 when he created the political assassination team to assassinate Fidel Castro and Raul Castro and Che Guevara and the others. And he therefore felt that he had successfully gotten away with the fact that the very assassination team that he had created in 1960 had killed President Kennedy. And that there was this terrible fear that he and his allies had that this might be discovered. But because of the steps that Lyndon Johnson had taken to suppress any kind of legitimate investigation of that by appointing the Warren Commission, headed up, in fact, by Allen Dulles, who was, in fact, the principal field commander for the assassination itself. So you actually had the ridiculous situation of the principal organizer of the assassination being de facto in charge of the investigation. And so that they thought that they had successfully suppressed any kind of effective investigation of the assassination of President Kennedy. And so here, by November of 1968, you have Richard Nixon back into the seat of power, okay, where he can command covert operations of the Central Intelligence Agency. He can use the powers of his presidency to prevent any conceivable revelation of the fact that President Kennedy had been assassinated by this professional assassination team that had been created by Richard Nixon to kill the Castros and Che Guevara. And so he ascends to power. And despite his promises during the election that he was going to try to end the war in Vietnam, he decided that he was going to try to end the war in Vietnam by massive carpet bombing in Vietnam, and the spraying of Agent Orange, the bombing with napalm of the people, basically bombing them into submission. And so from the time of his election in 1968 all the way to 1972, there was nothing but an increase in the fervor of the anti-Vietnam War movement in the United States, demands for the removal of Richard Nixon, the mounting of another anti-Vietnam War presidential candidacy in the person of George McGovern. But during this 4-year period of the first term of Richard Nixon, we saw a basic major sea change in the politics that we had reason to expect with the pending nomination of Bobby Kennedy in June of 1968, with Bobby Kennedy coming into the office of the presidency, reinvestigating the Kennedy assassination, revealing what had actually happened to the president, supporting the Federal Civil Rights Act. There would have been an entirely different political future for the United States had Bobby Kennedy ascended to the presidency and had not been assassinated. Okay? And the worst of all possible alternatives actually came to pass of Richard Nixon getting to be president. And going right back to those same policies of 1960 when he was vice president under Eisenhower with Allen Dulles as their CIA director. And he went forth to appoint 4 different members of the United States Supreme Court. He appointed Warren Burger to replace Earl Warren. He appointed Harry Blackmun. He appointed Lewis Powell. And worst of all, he appointed William Rehnquist, who is one of the great ogres of all time on the United States Supreme Court, an absolute intellectual gymnastic champion who is not the least bit deterred by reality. So he took very seriously any kind of assignment that he was given. For example, prior to his being appointed to the United States Supreme Court by Nixon, he was appointed to be a special acting assistant United States attorney in the Justice Department by Richard Nixon. And one of his first tasks was to completely overhaul the entire federal criminal code. And he sat down with a team handpicked in which he began to propose amending every single law in the federal registry to oppose political opposition and unions. And for example, and this was all in a thing called Senate Bill 1. Senate Bill 1 was an 800-page omnibus statute that did things like it made criminally liable any officer of a labor union who authorized a strike against any business entity, that if there were any property damage or loss of life suffered during that strike, that the officer of the union would be held personally criminally responsible and sentenced to prison for that action. I actually drafted in Washington, D.C. A thing called the List of 100 Horrors. And I went through the entire Senate Bill 1 and listed out all of the horrendous things that this particular proposed piece of federal legislation was proposing. Fortunately, the Democrats were in charge of the House of Representatives at the time, and the Judiciary Committee was chaired by Father Bob Drinan, who was a Jesuit priest. And I happened to be the chief counsel for the Jesuit National Headquarters, National Office of Social Ministry. So I went down and sat down with him and discussed with him bringing Senate Bill 1 to the floor of the House of Representatives. And we succeeded in blocking that particular bill ever coming to the floor. But it was a disaster. I ended up chairing a national coalition of 80 national organizations opposing the passage of Senate Bill 1. But this type of activity on the part of the Nixon administration, appointing these hardcore, a lot of them right-wing judges to the Supreme Court, proposing this type of fascist legislation, these were just part of the characteristics that were going on. They also had the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover still, mounting a thing called the Counterintelligence Program, COINTELPRO they called it. What they were doing is through COINTELPRO, the FBI was infiltrating virtually every single anti-war organization. And they were infiltrating the black civil rights organizations. They infiltrated the National Organization for Women. And that they were putting agents provocateurs into these organizations to try to get them arrested and dismembered the organizations. So the counterintelligence program was going on. The CIA itself was engaged in a secret program they called Operation Shamrock, of also engaging in domestic covert operations on behalf of the Central Intelligence Agency to try to disrupt anti-war opponents, because they were taking the position that it was in defense of the national security of the United States to disrupt citizens groups in the United States who were opposing the war. And the United States military actually deployed members of their criminal intelligence divisions to spy on members of Congress who were opposed to the war in Vietnam. As of 1970, I had actually helped work on a major resolution called the Cooper Church Amendment that was sponsored by Senator Frank Church in Cooper from Tennessee, Frank Church from Idaho. And it was drafted by our team of people working for Professor Abe Shea at Harvard Law School. And we actually, I was fortunate enough to be one of the 5 point briefers to the United States Senate to meet with the United States senators to brief them on how they could constitutionally withdraw all funding from the war in Vietnam and therefore stop the Nixon administration from continuing to prosecute that war. And I also, very fortunately, was recruited right out of Harvard Law School to go to the major law firm in New York, Cahill Gordon, Sonnet, Reindel, and Ohl, and happened to be the fortunate person to be the recipient of the telephone call from the chief legal counsel for the New York Times, coming to my office and letting me know that they had obtained a copy of the Pentagon Papers, which was the 72 or the 47 volume deeply top secret internal government study of the causes of the war in Vietnam. And so I was very fortunate to be in a position where I had not only gotten to be a point briefer to the United States Senate on the resolution to withdraw funding from the Vietnam War, I then immediately thereafter was at the law firm that was representing, that got to represent the New York Times and the Pentagon Papers, and got to read all 47 volumes of the classified documents and interoffice memos of the Pentagon, laying out the lies, one lie after another. It revealed the fact that in 1954, when the Vietnamese rose up in revolt against the French, who had been allowed to come back into Vietnam after World War II to reassert their colonial power in Vietnam, they were surrounded in 1954 at Dien Bien Phu by General Giap, who poured down death on these French soldiers at Dien Bien Phu until they surrendered. And then the French surrendered and agreed to withdraw from Vietnam, and the Vietnamese graciously agreed to allow all the French military forces to withdraw below, I believe it was the 38th parallel in Vietnam, under the explicit condition that under no circumstances would that line below which they were allowed to withdraw ever be considered any kind of a political boundary. And then they went to have the 1954 Geneva Convention or Accords for the peace treaty between France and Vietnam, authorizing the withdrawal. And the United States, under Richard Nixon, heading up the 54-12 Committee, the National Security Council, with the authorization of Eisenhower, immediately secretly shipped into Vietnam Ngo Dinh Diem, who was a graduate student at Columbia University, and shipped him into Vietnam and immediately recognized him as the president of the Republic of South Vietnam, which had never existed in history, and then sent in U.S. military advisors to support them. And then this whole thing was revealed in the internal documents of the Pentagon Papers, including the fact that Lyndon Johnson had fabricated information about an alleged Bay of Tonkin event that he said the United States warships, 2 United States warships, were fired upon by the Viet Cong on the open seas. Whereas, in fact, the warships had been firing on the shoreline of Vietnam, and that nobody had attacked them. It was a complete fiction. And Lyndon Johnson, fully aware of that, used it as a pretext for sending in eventually 500,000 United States military personnel to try to overthrow Vietnam and to take control of it, to establish a U.S. land base in Southeast Asia. Okay? And all of this information was revealed in the internal documents of the Pentagon Papers. And so that I was fortunate enough to get to read them and participated in briefing the case to go all the way to the United States Supreme Court, in which we won the First Amendment right to publish those papers on the front page of the New York Times, which was one of the major events of this historical period that led to the more rapid end of the war in Vietnam. But all of this was going on during this period of the first term of Richard Nixon. And there were major uprisings across the United States. I mean, up at Berkeley, I mean, there were people rolling cars over in the street and setting them on fire. I mean, there were things getting blown up around the country. I mean, there was open warfare going on against the administration of Richard Nixon. There was actually an incipient revolution taking place here in the United States. Now, a great part of this revolution was nonviolent. There were massive demonstrations, marches in the streets, people surrounding buildings and sitting down and blocking the passages to buildings such as the Pentagon and other places. But there was, in fact, a growingly militant portion of the resistance to the Nixon administration, the Weather Underground, the Black Panthers, others who basically took up arms against the administration of Richard Nixon. They were perfectly aware of the fact that Richard Nixon was a criminal and an international war criminal, and they felt authorized to take up arms against him. So this entire set of activities was going on in this period from 1968 up to 1972. And then we came to the point of the 1972 re-election campaign of Richard Nixon. And what this led to was this extraordinary set of events where the Democratic Party nominated George McGovern, a very progressive United States Senator from South Dakota, to run against Richard Nixon, again, on an anti-Vietnam War platform. And as long as he was doing the anti-Vietnam War platform, he basically brought in all of the rest of the basic proposals very similar to Bernie Sanders, saying, look, if we're going to have a progressive position against the war in Vietnam, we can have a progressive position on medical assistance, we can have a progressive position on a welfare assistance, a whole set of social democratic policies that he put in. Richard Nixon and his political campaign staff targeted the election of George McGovern. They viewed people who opposed them politically as criminals, that people that were basically subversive, that here we were at war in Vietnam against a people not unlike Afghanistan, who had no air force, who had no standing armies, who basically had no shoes, that were carrying the military supplies on their back, trying to fight off the largest military in the entire history of human civilization. And the Nixon administration was being waged war against, basically, at home. We would bring 1 million people into the streets of Washington, D.C. and surround the White House. I had the great good fortune of doing the litigation that struck down the anti-demonstration rules around the White House that Richard Nixon had issued, prohibiting anybody from protesting anywhere within the view of the White House. Okay, so that we were basically in pitched warfare against the Nixon administration, who we viewed to be basically a criminal syndicate that had taken control of the administration of our government through killing two major Democratic presidential campaign people, John Kennedy and then his brother Bobby, and killing Martin Luther King as well. it was clear to all of us what was going on, and it motivated a huge uprising against Richard Nixon. So he had developed a bunker mentality, kind of literally. He would hide out in the White House and not dare go anywhere. Because if he would appear anywhere, even for campaign speeches and stuff, he would be besieged by thousands of demonstrators, protesting him and calling for his impeachment and imprisonment, and for the imprisonment of his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, for war crimes. And so this was the kind of state of affairs that obtained in the summer of 1972. Leading up to the November election of 1972. This was the setting in which Richard Nixon hired a special team of covert operations people to come to the White House and serve as his security people for the election. And he hired E. Howard Hunt to head up this operation. And E. Howard Hunt was instructed to do things by Richard Nixon through a fellow by the name of Jeb Magruder to actually burglarize the psychiatrist's office for Daniel Ellsberg. Once he discovered that Daniel Ellsberg had been the source of the Pentagon Papers to us at the New York Times. And so they burglarized Dan Ellsberg's office. And in fact, then they charged Dan Ellsberg with treason for revealing the content of the Pentagon Papers. They charged him with espionage, and we put on the defense. I got to write some briefs for this for the Office of Rabinowitz, Bodine, and Standard. Leonard Bodine was the chief counsel in defending Ellsberg. And they put in all the motions showing things that, like, his psychiatrist's office had been burglarized. And I mean, it wasn't a subtle operation. They broke the locks off the psychiatrist's office and went in and crowbarred open the files and took out just the files on Ellsberg. I mean, this is not a sophisticated operation. And in fact, the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., which turned out to be just about 3 buildings down from my offices in Washington, D.C., that Richard Nixon actually proposed, because they were opposing the war and writing memos against the war, he actually proposed that somebody ought to go and set a fire in the building of the Brookings Institution. Somebody ought to go set a fire in that building, And E. Howard Hunt was actually entertaining the idea of doing that. I mean, this is the kind of base criminality that was infecting the administration. But all that was really reflective of is the fact that the covert operations people that had been working with the Central Intelligence Agency at the behest of Richard Nixon back from 1952 to 1960, when he was the vice president under Eisenhower and the chairman of the 5412 Committee of the National Security Council, that he had been authorizing and directing activities just like that against foreign powers. And now, Richard Nixon, when he became president, he rationalized it in his mind that because all of these citizens of the United States were opposing his war in Vietnam, that they were part of the enemy. And so therefore he could deploy against them the same exact tactics that had been previously used by the Central Intelligence Agency against enemies of the state. And that's what he was engaged in doing. And so what he did is, all of this was taking place when suddenly in early May of 1972, just by the same month where we are here still, vis-a-vis the election coming up in November, that in May, the Democratic National Committee chose to become the head of the Democratic National Committee, Larry O'Brien. And Lawrence O'Brien had, for the previous some 12 to 14 years, been the chief lobbyist in Washington, D.C. for Howard Hughes. Now, that wouldn't have meant anything to most people, but it certainly meant something to Richard Nixon. Because, as you'll recall in the earlier lectures, Richard Nixon, back in 1960, after he'd been the vice president for Eisenhower for 8 years, had secured the nomination for the Republican Party presidential nomination. And immediately upon that, actually immediately upon knowing that Nelson Rockefeller, I mentioned to you, had withdrawn from the Republican presidential primary race in Michigan, Nixon knew that he was going to be the nominee for the Republican Party. He had contacted Howard Hughes, who had become a national security advisor to the National Security Council, a special security advisor, and he asked Howard Hughes to set up the political assassination team to assassinate Fidel Castro and Raul Castro and Che Guevara and the other 5 comandantes of the new revolutionary government in Cuba. And so that when Larry O'Brien was named in May of 1972 to be the head of the new head of the Democratic National Committee to head up the campaign against Richard Nixon in his reelection, Richard Nixon became terrified that somehow the word was out that Larry O'Brien knew that his principal, Howard Hughes, had been retained basically by Richard Nixon to set up the political assassination team that had killed President Kennedy. And so Richard Nixon became catalyptic about this, and so he ordered Jeb Magruder to basically direct E. Howard Hunt and the other people to burglarize the offices of the Democratic National Committee and to wiretap the telephones of Larry O'Brien and another guy by the name of Spencer Oliver, and to bug his office to determine whether or not, A, he knew about the fact that Richard Nixon had created this assassination team to kill Castro, and secondly, that assassination team had been the one that killed President Kennedy. And to determine, thirdly, whether or not Larry O'Brien, if he knew about either or both of these things, was he planning to use that against Richard Nixon in the campaign. And so what happened is they went in, the plumbers unit, they called them, the White House plumbers unit, went into the offices of the Democratic National Committee in early June and placed the bugs on the telephones and the wiretapping or the listening devices in the offices. And it turns out that along about the 15th of June of 1972, they realized that one of the bugs in the telephone had stopped working. And so they decided to go back into the Watergate Hotel, into the National Democratic headquarters on the night of June 17th of 1972 to burglarize the offices and go back in and replace the bug in the phone. And they did that, and we've discussed it in passing here a number of times in the course already, but bottom line is that they went into James McCord, who was a CIA wiretapping specialist, was asked to go in with them to make certain that the wiretap was now secure on the telephones of Larry O'Brien. And accompanying him were Virgilio Gonzalez, Rolando Martinez, it's Eugenio Rolando Martinez, and Bernard Barker. All of them, all 3 of them being right-wing, Miami-based, anti-Castro Cuban exiles who were former gunmen for Santos Trafficante when he was the head of the mafia in Havana. And accompanying them in the Watergate Hotel was Frank Sturgis, who, as you may remember, was the liaison from the Central Intelligence Agency to the anti-Castro Cuban exile base on No Name Key off the coast of Florida, who is the one who had led that unauthorized raid against a Russian ship sitting in the harbor of Havana on December 3rd, following the successful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, thereby threatening to undo the entire agreement that had been established between Kennedy and Khrushchev. So there's Frank Sturgis with 3 anti-Castro Cuban Miami-based exiles, along with James McCord, the chief wiretapping specialist for the Central Intelligence Agency, inside the Democratic National Committee. They taped the door to the outside door to the Democratic National Party headquarters, and they go in and start replacing the bug. And then one of them came out to check the door and found out that the night watchman had come by, I told you this before, had come by and removed the tape from the lock on the door. What they do is open the door and then tape it closed so it doesn't relock. And so that they had taped it up. The night watchman came by and took the tape off the door. Then one of the guys goes back down to check the perimeter and discovers that the tape has been removed from the door, and like a total doofus ends up retaping the door. So that when the night watchman came back around again within another half an hour, the door was retaped. So he calls the police, the Washington, D.C. police. The Washington, D.C. police call Carl Schloeffler, who's the head of the Washington, D.C. Organized Crime Strike Force, who was with these 5 other guys doing a surveillance that night of another crime scene or suspects. And so since they were in the immediate area, they responded and they went into the Watergate Hotel and arrested all 5 of them. Okay? And when they arrested them, they took them into custody, and they found in the pocket of Bernard Barker, one of the 3 anti-Castro Cuban exiles. They found in the left inside coat pocket of his sports jacket a check that had been drafted on the Banco Internacional down in Mexico City, and took him into custody. And they were arraigned in night court because this was like 11 o'clock at night. They arrested them. They were taken into the night court, and a young cub reporter from the Washington Post by the name of Bob Woodward was there at the arraignment. And when James McCord was asked by the arraigning magistrate what his name and place of employment were, he said that his name was James McCord and he worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. What he actually said is, Central Intelligence Agency, like that. And the judge said, excuse me? He said, the Central Intelligence Agency. And Bob Woodward heard this and went back to his editors at the Washington Post and met with Ben Bradley, who has just recently passed away this past year. But Ben Bradley assigned Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, another young reporter there, to find out what this was all about. And so that there was a major series of events that began to unfold, which you can read in Bob Woodward's book, his first book, called All the President's Men. Now, to make it a little easier, there's also a motion picture of this, starring Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman, and Jason Robards playing Ben Bradley. And so this series of events started to unfold, and very interestingly, the pressure that was being put on by these articles that were being written by the Washington Post were causing great consternation inside the White House eventually. But what happened is that Richard Nixon was down at his place in Key Biscayne when the burglary took place on the night of June 17th of 1972. But he read about it in the papers, was contacted the next morning. He was down visiting at his home. It was Bibi Rebozo, a major mafia character, or a minor mafia character, actually. But in any event, he comes back to Washington, D.C., and on the morning of June 21st of 1972, his chief of staff, Bob Haldeman comes into his office and says, "Mr. President, I believe that we've got a problem here." And Richard Nixon said to him, "What is that, Bob?" And he said, "Well, I just got a call from John Dean, the White House counsel to the president, legal counsel. He just got a call from Pat Gray, the new head of the FBI, because J. Edgar Hoover had just died a few weeks earlier. And L. Patrick Gray says they found a check inside the pocket of Bernard Barker, and it's been drowned on this bank down in Mexico City. And he's getting a lot of pressure from the people in the FBI to go down to Mexico City and investigate this account where the check came from. And L. Patrick Gray wants to know if this is going to cause any trouble for the White House." And Richard Nixon says to Bob Haldeman, "Bob, I want you to go get John," it's John Ehrlichman, "and you and he go on over to the agency," that is the CIA, over at Langley, "and I want you to go and see Dick Helms, the director of the CIA, and Vernon Walters, the deputy, and you tell them to contact the FBI right away and tell them to get the hell out of this part of this investigation." And so Bob Haldeman, after a moment, he says to him, "Well, what am I supposed to tell them to say?" And he says, "You just have them tell the FBI that if they don't get out of this investigation right away, all the Mexico stuff about the Bay of Pigs guys could all come out." And after some hesitation, Bob Haldeman says, "Well, will they know what that means?" And he said, "Oh yes, they'll know what that means." Okay, so they went ahead and did that. Bob Haldeman went over, got John Ehrlichman. They went over and saw Dick Helms and Vernon Walters. They got them to contact the FBI, and they shut down that part of the investigation. But the young Beagle boys from Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, continued their quest for attempting to find out what was going on. Why were these people in the Watergate Hotel? And it turns out that Bob Woodward developed a confidential source. Which, bizarrely enough, Bob Woodward referred to as Deep Throat, which I won't go into. But the bottom line is that after the election took place, and Richard Nixon handily beat George McGovern because George McGovern was basically a semi-incompetent campaigner. No, don't. The bottom line is that he originally McGovern picked a fellow to run as his vice presidential candidate, and then a guy by the name of Tom Eagleton. After he'd already selected him at the 1972 Democratic Presidential Convention, he found out that Eagleton, after the death of his wife, had gone and had some psychological conferences with a psychologist because he was feeling depressed about his wife having died. And that got out that he had actually attended a psychologist, or psychiatrist actually, and they were also terrified that the American people wouldn't understand that that didn't mean he was psychotic, that he dumped him as his vice presidential running mate, and then had to desperately kind of scrounge around and finally get Walter Mondale to come on as his. It was very disrupted, and not only that, but McGovern, after getting the nomination, did a kind of a whole, not a full 180-degree turn on his policies, but at least a 90-degree change in his policies. I know I ran his primary campaign, his Democratic primary campaign in the 14th Congressional District of New York, and then went on to become the deputy campaign director in New York State for him, running all the voter registration in New York. And I know that after McGovern did an about-face on, he ended up okaying, said he would agree with the sale of a whole large number of F-15 fighter planes to Israel, which was just a blatant effort to kind of pander to the Israeli lobby at that particular time, and it was just poorly handled, just ineptly handled. I mean, most of the pandering that goes on in that regard is usually much more sophisticated. And he didn't know how to do it very well at that time, so it was terribly embarrassing. And I ended up leaving the campaign at that point because I didn't want to stay on anymore. And then that is why I then went to F. Lee Bailey's office. And I was there when they brought me in because they were actually representing James McCord, the Watergate wiretap specialist. So I went into F. Lee Bailey's office, and F. Lee Bailey had me on the Watergate burglary case. And that is why I started to investigate what exactly was happening in the Watergate Hotel. Why was it that these three anti-Castro Cuban exiles were in the hotel burglarizing the Democratic National Committee headquarters? Why is it that the liaisons for them were E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis, who were CIA liaisons? Why were they in there? What were they doing? And that's when I was told in May of 1973 that I was told through my chief investigator that by Santos Trafficante what was going on. And he explained all about Richard Nixon panicking over Larry O'Brien being made the head of the Democratic National Committee, and then went on to tell me why. He went on to tell Bad Andy Tooney why, who then told us, is that Nixon had put together this assassination team that was to kill Castro, the brothers, et cetera, and went on to tell us that this was the group that killed President Kennedy. I mean, that was the very first time that anybody had heard about that. So there I was, kind of flabbergasted in May of 1973, having found out that President Kennedy was assassinated by this S-force of 15 anti-Castro Cuban exiles that had been put together by Richard Nixon. And the bottom line is that this created chaos, actually, in the country, because when McCord McCord asserted that Jerry Alch, who was one of the three trial lawyers in our office, F. Lee Bailey, Jerry Alch, and myself, that McCord wrote a letter to Judge Sirica, who was the federal judge sitting on the criminal case against all the Watergate burglars. McCord wrote a letter to Sirica saying that he had been told by Gerald Alch that if he would remain silent and get all of the other burglars to remain silent about who it is that had ordered them to go in to burglarize the Watergate Hotel, or the Democratic National Committee, that he could expect to be given presidential clemency and would not have to serve any time in jail. And he was upset by this, and he wrote a letter to Judge Sirica telling Sirica that. And because of that, Judge Sirica read the letter aloud in court. And all the news media, of course, were covering this trial, you know, as you might guess. And so it went out all across the country, and it hit the fan. And the United States Congress, then the House of Representatives Judiciary Committee began to investigate this, because the Judiciary Committee of the House of Representatives has the jurisdictional authority to potentially impeach a president of the United States for engaging in obstructing justice. And so that, because if in fact there had been an offer of presidential clemency to silence them, to keep them from revealing the fact that they'd been ordered by high-level officials in the White House to burglarize the Democratic National Committee, that was a whole series of crimes that were impeachable offenses. And so the Watergate Committee began to investigate this whole thing, and a fellow by the name of Scott Armstrong, who worked for Peter Rodino, who was the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, was interviewing a White House staffer by the name of Alexander Butterfield. When Butterfield revealed to Scott Armstrong that Richard Nixon had a secret recording system set up inside the Oval Office. And so that if in fact the Watergate, the Judiciary Committee of the House of Representatives wanted to have, to know exactly what conversations were going on surrounding this break-in and its potential cover-up, they could tell from these tape recordings. And so the Congress, the Judiciary Committee issued a subpoena for the tapes. And then they set up an entire special select committee of the House and Senate, the House and Senate Select Watergate Committee, to begin conducting and coordinating the investigation of this whole thing. And they subpoenaed the tapes as well. So they had, Richard Nixon asserted executive privilege over these tapes, saying that he had to protect the sanctity of confidential conversations between him and his advisors in the Oval Office. Not an entirely unreasonable position, but in light of what it was he was trying to protect, the argument was that whatever the privilege was would not go to protecting the criminal conspiracy to burglarize the Democratic National Headquarters and to obstruct justice by offering presidential clemency to these guys. And so there was this astonishing series of events that were going on in this period of time. This is all in this short period between the election of Richard Nixon immediately following the assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, which followed by just 8 years the assassination of President John Kennedy. And this huge disruption about the Watergate burglary and Richard Nixon being hauled up in front of the United States Congress, charging him potentially with criminal offenses to have him impeached. The president fighting back in hiding out in the White House, refusing to come out to be interviewed by anybody. This was an extraordinary set of events that were going on. And in fact, the Watergate Select Committee, when Nixon refused to provide the tapes to them, brought federal lawsuit in the United States District Court for the District of Columbia, seeking a writ of mandate from the federal court, ordering Nixon to provide the tapes for them. The Congress won that decision in the District Court. And when it was on its way to the Court of Appeals of the District of Columbia, Richard Nixon did this really interesting thing. He offered to provide an edited transcript of the tapes, but he couldn't have any confidence in anybody else doing the editing, so he stayed up night after night, drinking whiskey and trying to edit these things by playing them and then typing out, the edited portions, and basically becoming insane. If you had assumed he hadn't been before, but the bottom line is he basically became nutty during this entire period, and people were actually so worried about him that they wouldn't allow any loaded weapons to be around him anywhere, for fear that he was going to kill himself. I mean, that's how bad things were getting at that point. But the bottom line is that he submitted the edited transcripts, and mysteriously there was an 18.5-minute gap in the transcripts that you've heard about. And it turns out it was also in the tape, because they did an investigation and found out that in order for this tape to have been erased like it was, that it was virtually impossible for that to be done accidentally. And so that there had to be an intentional editing of 18.5 minutes of the tape, which turned out to be a conversation between Richard Nixon and Bob Haldeman, where Nixon explained to Haldeman what it was that had to be protected, why they couldn't allow E. Howard Hunt to talk about what was going on. And so, that is why Bob Haldeman, when he was asked by the Watergate hearings, Sam Ervin, the chairman from the Democratic senator from North Carolina, asked Bob Haldeman, he said, we're going to play for you this other tape that talks about, on the 21st, where it says, you ask President Nixon, what are you supposed to tell, Vernon Walters and Dick Helms to say to the FBI? And Nixon said to you, tell them that if they don't get out of this part of the investigation right now, all the Mexico stuff about the Bay of Pigs guys could all come out. And you asked the president, well, will they know what that means? And he said, yes, they'll know what that means. And so Sam Ervin said to Bob Haldeman, what did that mean? And he said, I think that they were talking about the assassination of President Kennedy. Okay? Which Bob Haldeman realized because he knew what was in the 18.5 minutes of edited out tape, you see. And so that the Court of Appeals, when the Watergate Special Select Committee refused to accept the edited tapes, they demanded the actual originals of the tape so they could hear everything, and Nixon refused, and so the Court of Appeals ruled against Nixon, and it went up to the United States Supreme Court. And the United States Supreme Court ruled against Richard Nixon and ruled that he had to turn over all of the tapes to the Watergate Select Committee. And as soon as that decision came in, Richard Nixon went on national television and resigned and turned over the White House turned over the presidency to Gerald Ford, whom he had hand-selected as his vice president after dismissing Spiro Agnew, enforced his resignation because Spiro Agnew had been targeted and found out that he was accepting bribes in a brown paper bag across the desk of his Oval Office for payments for contracts that he had agreed to allow when he was the governor of Maryland. And so that Richard Nixon handpicked, not that they don't at the convention, the president usually picks whoever their vice presidential candidate is going to be, but he got to pick an actual vice president because he was sitting as the president when Spiro Agnew resigned, so he picked Gerald Ford, who also happened to be on the Warren Commission. And so, Gerald Ford takes over as the president and immediately issues a pardon to Richard Nixon, even though Richard Nixon had never been formally charged with anything. And so he issues a presidential pardon for him. But the information had started coming out during the Watergate break-in now that there was all of this talk about the Mexican stuff, and it involved the assassination of President Kennedy, and what the hell is this all about? And so what they did is they followed up the Watergate Select Committee in the Congress. They followed it up by establishing a second Special Select Committee on intelligence abuse to actually investigate why it is that the three mafia gunmen who were in the hotel were with James McCord, a CIA wiretapping specialist, and Frank Sturgis, the CIA liaison to the Miami Cubans, and E. Howard Hunt, all of whom were CIA people. And so that they impaneled, after the Watergate hearings, they impaneled a new Special Select Committee chaired by Senator Frank Church of Idaho, called the Church Committee, but it's the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence Abuse. And they began to inquire into the long history of criminal activity of the Covert Operations Division of the Central Intelligence Agency. And they tracked it all the way on back, and then they discovered this thing about Richard Nixon having created this assassination team. And that had to do with potentially assassinating Fidel Castro and Raul Castro. And then they said, oh no, look at this. This is something that if in fact this had been known during the Warren Commission investigation, it clearly hadn't been known. If it had been known, there would have been a much deeper investigation of this assassination team. And so what they did is they then authorized the creation of a House Select Committee on Assassinations to reinvestigate the Kennedy assassination. So what you see happening here is there was a whole cascading of events that took place from the time of the assassination of President Kennedy in November of 1963 all the way through the next period of time from 64 into 68, and then into the election of 68 into 72, all the way into this period when it all came full circle to the point where there was a demand being made by the political establishment for a reinvestigation of the assassination of President Kennedy. And that group reinvestigated the assassination of President Kennedy, and they came to the conclusion that it is more probable than not that President Kennedy was assassinated by a conspiracy, and that the most likely suspects in this conspiracy are in fact a certain element of Miami-based anti-Castro Cuban refugees and a certain element of organized crime. And they specifically officially requested the United States Justice Department to continue the investigation as a criminal investigation, since this was beyond the jurisdiction of the Congress. And of course, that was a request that was made in 1975, and Gerald Ford was still the president at the time, having come in August of 1974, and he refused to direct the Justice Department to investigate. And so things were in such a sorry state that the people were so angry at Gerald Ford for having pardoned Richard Nixon, and were so upset now over the fact that the government under Gerald Ford refused to have the Justice Department reinvestigate the assassination of President Kennedy, as had been formally requested by the Congress now, that Gerald Ford ended up still being the candidate for the Republican Party for the president, and the Democratic Party felt compelled to find someone to serve as the Democratic Party nominee who was almost certainly going to beat Gerald Ford in the 1976 presidential election. They had to find someone who was going to be a person beyond reproach. And so Bob Strauss, who was the head of the Democratic National Committee by that time, Bob Strauss handpicked Jimmy Carter from Georgia, the former governor of Georgia, who was basically as clean as a hound's tooth, as they said. And it is probably one of the most decent people ever to be elected to the presidency, much to his chagrin. Because, as it turned out, immediately upon him coming into office, he was set upon by all of these forces that we've been talking about. Because the last thing that these forces want in the White House is a person of honesty and integrity. So that's where we'll take it up on Thursday. We'll be dealing with the Carter administration and what that has to say about our team of people. Okay. Now we've still got a few minutes left for 10 minutes or so for questions. It's another one of those things of a drink from the fire hose. But yes.
The assassination of Bobby Kennedy, was that also done by the assassination team?
It's not clear. Someone raised that question earlier in the discussion group. I don't know, because I've never been tasked with actually investigating it. I mean, I know basically, well, I know probably more than you know, because you guys were live then, but I only know what I've read a lot about it and just little rumors that I've heard. But I've never been tasked or given the resources to investigate that. All of these things that I've talked to you about, I happen to have been in a kind of a unique position to have been specifically authorized to conduct the investigations. I had the resources to do it, and I would hire, professional, Class A licensed private investigators and former military intelligence people and stuff like that to gather the information and give it to me. And I don't know about that. So I don't know that. The only thing that I do know, the one piece that I know, is that James Braden, who was arrested coming out of the hotel after Bobby Kennedy was killed on the night of June 6th and the early morning of June 7th of 1968, James Braden was also arrested coming out of the Hunt building on November 22nd, 1963, directly behind President Kennedy, looking directly down onto President Kennedy where he was shot and killed. And Braden was allowed to go free both times. So that's all we really know about that. I mean, that we know definitively. Otherwise, just know whatever you can read about it. But I don't have any particular insight. A lot of what I'm telling you here is kind of inside information about what had happened, because I happen to know it. Okay, what else before we all have to go running off into the outside world?
Before hearing the account of Santos Traficante, who do you believe did the assassination?
Pardon? I didn't hear the first part.
Before you guys heard the account of Santos Traficante.
No, but before I got this information from Santos Traficante, I didn't know. I mean, I wasn't actually even in a position to have investigated it. All I knew is that most everybody in my generation didn't believe the Warren Commission report, primarily because of this single bullet theory. I didn't know anything about the deeper background of Oswald. I didn't know that Oswald had been recruited into the illusionary warfare operation. I didn't know he'd been trained at the Monterey Language School in Russian. I didn't know that he had been met at the port of entry at Hoboken, New Jersey, when he got back from Russia by the secretary of the Eastern anti-Bolshevik people. I didn't know any of that stuff. I didn't know that he was working for the Foreign Intelligence Digest, financed by H.L. Hunt and Charles Willoughby. I didn't know any of that stuff. So I was shocked, actually, when I was told that. I mean, we were all shocked. I mean, Bad Andy Tooney was shocked. Bill Taylor, my other investigator, was totally shocked by it. But it's one of those kind of things that is so shocking that your adrenaline level is so high when you're told it that you never forget it. It's just like emblazoned into your memory what it is you're told at that time, and that caused both Bill Taylor and myself both to leave the Bailey firm, that we didn't want to be there anymore and be involved in that stuff, and so I went back to Harvard Divinity School. He was just stopped. He was stopped in the general dragnet after the assassination of President Kennedy. They were sort of picking up people when he was coming out of the H.L. Hunt building. They picked him up and questioned him and had a record of it. And the same thing happened after the Bobby Kennedy assassination. They kind of rounded up people that were right there, just kind of milling around. They picked them up and questioned them. And it was only later that it was discovered that he was at both places. So he was just detained for questioning. He wasn't formally arrested or charged with anything.
Who was he?
Well, that's an interesting question. He was a convicted criminal who had various relations to some organized crime people who were also involved with Jack Ruby. So we know that much about him. You mean the John Kennedy?
No, you said that after the Kennedy assassination, Bobby was
Oh, yeah, but it was being done through this guy. There was a particular guy. I'll get his name. Bill. It's the same name as this big. No, the big basketball player for the Seattle Sonics. A big tall guy, Bill. Walton. That's it. Good. There was a fellow with the same name, Bill Walton, who was in fact the courier that would go between Bobby and to Khrushchev, telling him that in fact both Bobby and Jackie both believed that the president had been killed by a tiny cabal of very wealthy and powerful people in the United States. And Bobby had confided to a couple different people that when he became president, that he intended to reopen the investigation of the killing of his brother and bring them to justice. Okay? All right, time to go back to the outside world. Okay, I'll see you on Thursday.